This morning, we're going to bring things a little closer to home. And I hope to do that in the next few minutes to talk about key issues facing Kentucky. And if this will work correctly, there we go. The topic that we've been talking about yesterday and today is to try to focus on the future, try to look into the future, and that's why our folks chose this lens to illustrate that we're trying to look forward into the future of Kentucky. So I want to talk just a second about how do you develop a big vision. And my approach to that is fairly simplistic, actually. You either start with a big vision or you start with a list of ideas, things that you need to do. You just go out here and you find what you need to do to make things better, and that evolves up into a bigger vision. At the end of the day, you really need both. You really need both. And I'll use the analogy of getting an old house. Let's say you're driving down Main Street in your town and you see this place that is a fixer-upper. That'd be the nice way to put it, I guess. All right, what's your vision for this? What do you want to do with this if you and your spouse say, hey, let's buy that house and do something with it? Your vision might be to operate a bed and breakfast. Maybe that's been your lifelong dream. That's the vision. Everything else flows from that. Your vision might be to tear it down. Let's tear it down and start over. Or your vision might be to make it a show place where you could entertain a lot and have big parties there. So what you have as your ultimate goal drives everything else you're going to do. If, on the other hand, you go into that property, you're thinking about living there, and you start with a list of ideas, you say, well, we got to patch the roof, we got to fix the porch, and boy, wouldn't it be nice to have a hot tub upstairs. That would be nice. So you start with a list of ideas that develops into something that is much bigger and grander at the end. So a few years ago, our chamber decided in 2015 something big was about to happen, and that was a governor's race. A lot of issues were going to be on the table, and so we decided to develop a vision for Kentucky, frankly, to try to influence the discussion within that governor's race, and I think we had some success with that. We wanted to look down the road to find out what the future of Kentucky might look like, and we wanted to influence the dialogue to try to create a substantive conversation during that year. So, what was the vision? What was our list of ideas? How were we going to start all that? This was our board of directors of the Kentucky Chamber. They decided to get involved. They had a big session. We brought in a consultant from Research Triangle in North Carolina to hold sessions. We did a survey of members and all that to try to put together a vision and a list of ideas. The big vision was a bright future. We wanted a bright future. And you would say, well, of course you want a bright future. That doesn't really say anything. But we also decided to create a culture of competitiveness. Our state needed to be competitive, not just for business and industry, but for young talent, for example. We needed to be competitive. And so how did we do that? How did that flow? Well, the list of ideas, there were dozens that came up during that process. People had a lot of ideas. For example, we need to improve our educational rankings. We needed to improve our health indicators. We're not a healthy state. We needed to improve our per capita income. We needed to reduce our pension debt. You heard a lot about that yesterday. We're in terrible shape in Kentucky. And we needed to preserve low-cost energy. Now, there were dozens. These are just 5 samples of things that came up as that list of ideas of things we needed to do to achieve our vision. We produced this report called 4 Pillars for Prosperity, and it's available online at our website, kychamber.com. This is the plan that came out of that process in 2015. So you had the 4 Pillars for Prosperity. What were they? Workforce. That is the common theme across businesses from UPS and Toyota down to the person who puts shingles on your roof. Workforce is the common issue right now. And for the foreseeable future, I think that's going to be the common business issue. What kind of workforce? A healthy and skilled workforce. Not just an educated workforce, but also a healthy workforce. We have major challenges in that department. The second pillar was government, had to do with government. What kind of government? We wanted a sustainable government. It's not sustainable in terms of solar panels on the buildings, but sustainable in terms of a government that's financially sustainable and can pay its bills, can bring in an appropriate amount of revenue and pay its bills. And when we get to the pension problem, That's a real challenge for us. Infrastructure. What kind of infrastructure? 21st century infrastructure, modern infrastructure, not just roads and bridges, the traditional way of thinking about it, but also broadband. The types of infrastructure you need to produce a knowledge-based economy. And then jobs. What kind of jobs? We were talking about aggressive job creation, entrepreneurism, recruiting talent, and that sort of thing, so that we could produce jobs for our kids and grandkids. So those are the 4 pillars of prosperity. I say that as kind of an introduction to then move to what are the big issues that we face today. I'll get to that in just a minute. Under those pillars, we produced a bunch of building blocks under workforce, government, infrastructure, and jobs. Okay, just a few examples here. 4th grade math. We were going to watch how we do in 4th grade math. How we do on our bond rating. That has a whole lot to do with the pension problem. These are just examples. How are we doing on broadband? What percentage of our population has access to high-speed broadband? How are we doing on exports? Actually, that's a good news story about Kentucky. We actually fight above our weight on exports, in part because of our agricultural community, but also manufacturing. So these are the just examples of the types of things, the strategies that were developed under the 4 pillars. Now, if you go onto our website, kychamber.com, this is a screenshot of what we call our dashboard. You can go on there and look at all these different indicators of how we're doing. For example, you can go there on 4th grade math. No, that's 8th grade math, and it shows how we're doing compared to the U.S. average on 8th grade math. You can look at other states and that sort of thing. So constantly we update this so you can see how Kentucky is doing on dozens of indicators that were chosen out of this planning process to try to measure how we're doing. Not just talking about how we're going to do better, but actually measure it. So that's on our website if you want to look it up. I encourage you to do that. So today, what is our goal today? Those were the 4 pillars 4 years ago. What is our big vision for today? That's what brings us to the discussion this morning. Still a bright future, still a culture of competitiveness. What are the list of ideas? Last year, if we had been doing this session just a year ago, we would have listed some things like right to work. That's one of the things, one of the strategies in there to make Kentucky more competitive. Repeal prevailing wage, you heard about that last night. Improve our legal climate. We don't have the best place in the world to do business in terms of the legal climate because you're more likely to get sued than you ought to be. Allow charter schools. Pass the P3 bill, public-private partnerships. All right, this is last year. If we'd been doing this a year ago, we would have had those on our list. The thing is, that and other things got done in the 2017 legislature. And here's the governor signing a bill, one of the priorities that was covered in the 4 pillars. So the point is we can make progress. Now, this is the business community's view. You might have other priorities, and I encourage you to think about those priorities as we're listing the 7 things this morning. But at this point, this makes the point that things can happen and can get done to make us a better place. So now, where are we? 7 pressing priorities, and I encourage you to think about your own, either for the state or for your region, your community. What are the priorities? I would suggest these. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, but let's take a look. Number 1, the most urgent, and that's the pension problem. It's not the sexiest topic in the world. Most business people don't drive to work in the morning thinking about the state's pension debt, but it's got us in a pretty deep ditch. There's an illustration of just the money that's flowing toward pensions. I won't bore you with a lot of statistics, but let me just mention it's about $50 billion in unfunded promises. Now, the pension systems talk about $32, $33 billion. The governor's talked about $80 billion. I think he's probably being overly conservative. Let's just pick a number in the middle, $50 billion. You say, well, it sounds like a whole lot of money. What is that? Think of the state's budget as $10 billion. The annual whole budget of the state, $10 billion. That would be like if you and your spouse earned $100,000 a year and somebody allowed you to buy a house for $500,000. It's more than a stretch. I don't know too many bankers that would do that. So you can't go on vacation, you can't eat out, you can't have cable, you can't send your kids to college because you took on this huge debt that is 5 times your annual income. That's what we're facing here in Kentucky. We don't have the money set aside. Matter of fact, the state worker fund is only funded at 15%. It's the worst funded pension public pension fund in the country. $15 set aside for every $100 of promises that we've made to our state employees and the retirees. Teachers are in better shape. There may be 56, I think, something like that. But it's a severe, severe problem, and it affects everything else. Just like the family that can't eat out or send their kids to college or go on vacation, we can't fund our universities. We can't give teachers a raise as long as this hangs over our head, and that's what Governor Bevin came into office swinging a 2x4 saying, we got to fix this. I admire him for that. Debt per capita, 50th. Illinois, arguably in worse shape than we are. They're already cutting back their universities more significantly than we did in this last round, where universities and colleges here, Dr. Box, the community college system, 4.5%, I think, this the last budget cut. And that's on top of a bunch of other cuts. So the governor has said we will have a special session later this year. I'm thinking probably late September, October, in that range. He wanted to do it this summer, but there's just a certain amount of process. His consultants are still working to try to figure out how deep the hole is and what are the prospects of coming out of it. Last week ago Friday, we sent to the administration a 5-page memo on how we feel like that pension problem can be addressed, just to have the input. We were invited to do that by Budget Director John Chilton, who was, is John here this morning? There he is, there he is. All right. I'm sure he's got the memo in his pocket there. He's probably reviewing it as we speak. But we're just trying to have input on, and the bottom line is we say that public pensions ought to reflect more closely what has happened in the private community and how private industry is dealing with pensions. So, number one was pensions, but also tied for number one as the most urgent is tax reform. The governor has said in his, let me back up. In terms of tax reform, a system that makes us more competitive with other states. A system that is simpler. We all would like to have a simpler tax system. Now, should we produce more money with that tax system? The governor, in his State of the Commonwealth address, said yes. And that was pretty amazing. Caught a lot of us off guard, caught the legislature off guard. They said, wait a minute, what are you talking about? You talking about taxes? I liken this to, and Diana back here, our consultant, convinced me that I shouldn't put a slide of Richard Nixon in here right after Governor Bevin. But I said, that's like Nixon going to China. Now, anybody in here over 50 knows what it means for Nixon to go to China? He could go to China because he was a Republican and he was going over there to open up China to trade, etc. If a Democratic president had tried to do that, he would have been accused of playing footsie with the communists, etc., etc. So Nixon had a unique ability to go to China. Well, you have a conservative Republican governor saying, hey, we've got to face up to this problem and we have got to consider new revenue. Now, the legislature will ultimately decide that, not the governor. So it's going to be very interesting over the next 90, 120 days to see how this rolls out. What does tax reform look like? Now, this is an overly simplistic outline. I would call it the idiot's guide to tax reform, but let me just try to illustrate this for a minute. If you make it more competitive, it's probably going to cost money. For example, there's something that a lot of the companies, and you heard this from UPS yesterday, they would like for Kentucky to go to single sales factor. Well, this is not a tax seminar, and I certainly wouldn't be the person to teach the tax seminar, but that is one item that would cost, I don't know, $150, $200 million if you did that to make Kentucky more competitive and attractive to business. Okay, so it's going to cost you money. You're going to subtract money from the state's budget. So you go down through several things. If you drop the personal or corporate income tax in Kentucky to make us more competitive, it's going to cost more money. You're going to take away money to become more competitive. And so what is that? X millions of dollars, X hundreds of millions of dollars. And to illustrate that, I use the example, and I hope John Schnatter out at Papa John's wouldn't mind me mentioning this, but let's say he was not from the Louisville area. Let's say he was up in Wisconsin. But he had developed this big pizza company. But for whatever business reason, he decides he needs to move that to further south. So he's looking at Kentucky, he's looking at Louisville, he's looking at Tennessee, he looks at Nashville. Here, here the taxes, corporate or personal, would be 6% state, and in Louisville, I think 2.25% local occupational tax, 8.25. Nashville would be 0 plus 0. Where are you going to locate your company? By the way, I was in Nashville earlier this week. I stopped at a stoplight and counted 10 construction cranes just from where I was sitting at that light. Amazing. So competitive tax code makes a difference in how people, there are people today sitting at home with their small business or in their corporate offices in Connecticut somewhere making decisions that will affect the future of Kentucky. And they do it on terms like this. What's it going to cost me? Now, how do you get money to cover, if you're not doing tax reform just to get less money, we can't do that. So how are you going to find new money? Close loopholes. Now, your exemption, I would call a loophole. My exemption, you would call a loophole, right? If you exempt, if I get an exemption because of charitable contributions or whatever, you say, well, that's great, Dave, that's a loophole. Well, if you get it, I look at it a little differently. So that's the challenge in closing loopholes. But for example, and this isn't a chamber proposal, but for example, in Kentucky, a significant amount of retirement income is tax-free, whereas the surrounding states, it's considerably different. That is a rich exemption in Kentucky. So what if you close that? You'd produce tens of millions, maybe $100 million. Those are the types of decisions, and that was talked about a little bit yesterday. So if you close loopholes, you would add money, and you'd get up to, say, X hundreds of millions of dollars. Maybe it would be enough to pay for becoming more competitive. But you still haven't addressed the pension problem. All right? So if your whole idea of doing tax reform is to bail us out of the pension problem, now you've got to find more revenue to pay for that, and who knows what that will be, hundreds of millions. So that's the challenge. If you're trying to make it more competitive, which Governor Bevin and, by the way, the Kentucky Chamber feel like we should have a more competitive system, how do you do that and do pensions? The third priority issue after pensions and taxes, we would say, is infrastructure. Infrastructure, what does that mean? It's roads and bridges, but it's also things, as I mentioned, like broadband. Infrastructure all over this state that makes it better to do business. In just a minute, we'll hear about how an Eastern Kentucky company is making a difference, but they can't do that without a certain amount of bandwidth. Infrastructure is critical for a lot of companies. One of them we heard from yesterday. Remember when that bridge, I don't know which way we're facing here, but the Sherman-Minton Bridge out here on the west side of town was closed because of a structural defect in I-64. Shut down I-64. Well, if you're UPS and you've got hundreds of planes going out, you need to load them. You've got trucks coming in from St. Louis, Indianapolis, you know, all that's coming here, and you shut down the major bridge. How does UPS do that? It costs them a lot of money to go around town to come into the airport. So infrastructure is critical for companies to be able to do business in Kentucky. We published this report, and I think you've got a copy, don't you? I think our folks did a terrific job. Bob and Diana, our consulting team, and then Elena laid that out beautifully, I think, to make the point that infrastructure is a lot of different things. And it's important to Kentucky, especially because we're sitting here in the middle of 2/3 of the U.S. population. An ideal place to be if we keep up our roads, if we take advantage of that central location. Our infrastructure needs, just look at all the different things. Dams, pipelines, public transit, river ports, not just the traditional roads and bridges. All those things need attention. And you could add others too, like for our intellectual infrastructure, your whole university system and that sort of thing is part of the infrastructure by which we move forward. Bottom line of that report is it's going to take a lot of dollars to have a 21st century system of infrastructure. The Sherman-Minton Bridge, those of you from northern Kentucky, you've heard probably more than you want to hear about this. That's the I-75 bridge into downtown Cincinnati, structurally deficient, and it's going to take a potload of money. The estimate, one estimate's $2.6 billion. I hear different estimates, but one of them's $2.6 billion, and it's very controversial. Are you going to charge tolls? That's kind of a big issue. We proposed for 3 or 4 years in a row, got it passed in the legislature, a P3 bill, public-private partnerships, and then it was vetoed by Governor Beshear. This year, Governor Bevin agreed with the move to get P3 legislation, and so we created this legislation, P3, public-private partnerships. It's the most comprehensive bill in the country. Now, we were kind of late to the party. A lot of other states had this already, As a matter of fact, that's the intersection that's right outside this hotel. That's Spaghetti Junction in Louisville. We had to use Indiana's P3 authorization bill in order to build those bridges because we didn't have one at the time. And by the way, there was an article in the Courier-Journal yesterday about the tolls are actually running ahead of schedule. The estimates actually were conservative, and the tolls in the first 6 months of operation are actually ahead of schedule. But it took tolls on the bridges for private money to be interested in funding this project, and it took Indiana's law to get it done. So that's why P3 is so important. If you think about the park system in Kentucky, a lot of our lodges are out of date. You look at the marinas, the golf courses, etc. What if the Marriott Corporation was lured in to come in and say, okay, give us a 30-year lease, 50-year lease, we'll redo that golf course, we'll operate the dining room, and by the way, we'll reduce your loss every year, Kentucky, by half. That's the power of P3, because there's a lot of money out there, a lot of private money that could be brought to bear, to say nothing about the business expertise to help run those parks or build those bridges. Issue number 4, number 5, number 6, and number 7 all have a common theme. What would that be? Beth, I'll ask a question of you. What would it be? Ding, ding, ding. All right, she gets the door prize. Ryan Quarles has a country ham for you, I bet. There he is. Right, workforce. That's the big issue facing Kentucky right now. And so let me mention how we're seeing this in terms of the 4 remaining top issues facing Kentucky. 1, we have to think in terms of how we train people for the jobs that exist today and the jobs that will be. K-12 education obviously is a huge part of that. Right now there's something going on. It doesn't get a whole lot of attention, but it should. It's to create a new accountability system. There was a federal law passed, ESSA, that said that all states have to produce a plan by 2018 about how you're going to score your schools in the future. Whatever system is put in place this year will probably be the way we score our schools for the next generation in Kentucky. You know, right now there's proficient and distinguished and that sort of thing for students in schools and all that. All that's being changed. Okay, so the Chamber's been involved in that somewhat. We have been pushing essential skills. That's what we hear from employers. The essential skills, in other words, the ability of a student to show up on time, show up the second day on time. That's an issue sometimes. They come in the first day and say, I really don't want this job. And so they don't come back. Show up drug-free. That's something schools are not normally tuned into. Why should they be concerned about workers showing up down the road drug-free? We're saying, hey, this has got to be taught as part of what it means to get a job and succeed in life. And there are various other ones. You can go online with we this year, working with the Kentucky Society of Human Resource Managers, SHRM, developed a definition of what those sometimes called soft skills, we call them essential skills. We want that built into the curriculum of our K-12 system. Not as a class, but as a way of approaching all your classes, as a way of communicating to students that there are requirements in life, especially in work life. We're very interested in closing the achievement gap. You take underserved populations, ethnic or socioeconomic, and the gap between them and other students in the school can sometimes be glossed over by how you average the scores for the school and say, the school's doing great. They're out there in the suburbs, great school, they do lots of neat things. And you're losing some of that population below. That has to be in the accountability system. How are we closing that gap to the extent that we can? And also, we have been pushing for clearer scores. There's been a proposal to have a 5-star system. A school's a 4-star school, 3-star school, whatever. What does that mean? Is there clear data behind that? Does that really communicate anything to an employer or a person buying a home in a neighborhood? What does it mean? Some vague notion of scoring schools that makes everybody feel kind of good about their school isn't satisfactory, we don't think, in the modern economy. So we're pushing for clear scores. Number 5, higher education. Higher education produces the brain power of our state. 62% of jobs, it is predicted, will require post-secondary education in the next 20 years. 62%. Now, what do you mean by post-secondary? Does that mean get a bachelor's degree? You know, there was talk during the governor's race about getting French literature degrees and history degrees and that sort of thing. Is that sufficient? We ought to have more people in STEM fields, et cetera, et cetera. Well, clearly we need more bachelor's degrees. Here in Louisville, there's a group committed to increasing 55,000 degrees. And by that, they mean we've got to get up to the national average, I think it is, or the average of their peers metro areas in terms of how many people have a bachelor's degree. But we also need associate's degrees. Dr. Box and the KCTCS produce associate degrees, so we have to factor that in too. And then also certifications, things like welding, things like medical coding. Those kinds of things are incredibly important. Matter of fact, sometimes more important and more high-paying than degrees. So we have to factor that in and keep track of how many certifications and degrees that we are producing. All those credentials help move up in your ability to earn with those designations. And we have to be aware of all those as producing brain power for our economy. I feel like we need to elevate higher education. You know, we have in Kentucky what we call our signature industries that we're so proud of. Thoroughbreds, automotive, bourbon, logistics, aluminum in western Kentucky, where I'm from originally. Aluminum is a signature industry in the Owensboro, Henderson, down in Russellville area. And of course, coal has been a signature industry. What if we start to think about higher education as a signature industry? Producing the brain power, the intellectual capacity, and the innovation that we need in our state. Not only just investing in our universities, trying to minimize the cuts that would come because of this pension problem, and invest in them and expect more in terms of producing students and brain power. Number 6, workforce participation. What do you mean by that? Well, Kentucky's kind of in a difficult situation here. We produced a report, also available on our online, if you want to delve into this. We need 165,000 more people in the workforce today in Kentucky just to get up to the national average of workforce participation. Ours is 57.6%. The national average is 62.7%. So the difference between those two statistics is 165,000 human beings that are not working today, able-bodied within the age range of the workforce that are not in the workforce today. Why is that? Let me give you 3 reasons why that is. And by the way, here's the report that we produced right there that's available. Incarceration. That's a big one. Back in 2008, I think we were incarcerating more people in Kentucky than any other state, at a faster pace, I mean. Some of that has started to be addressed by the legislature. But more than 35,000 Kentuckians were not available to participate in the workforce due to incarceration. So out of 165,000, that's a pretty big chunk. Now, are you going to open the jail cells today and say, okay, everybody go to work? No. Obviously, it's not that easy. But how you treat your population, whether you're training them in prison or they're watching cable TV, makes a difference. There is a population there that needs to be engaged. Secondly, disability. You joked a minute ago about Eric Kahn, whose truck was found on the Mexican border the other day, and we don't know where he is. He defrauded the Social Security system of hundreds of millions of dollars by using fake medical reports, getting people into his law office trailer thing, running them through like a factory, and had a federal judge on the take, and they just processed all these people in to get disability. So you have people in not just rural Kentucky, but in some of the urban areas too. Their goal is to get on disability for the government to support them, and that's part of our 165,000. And Eric Kahn, he's just one example of that fraudulent system that has been allowed to run pretty rampant in Kentucky. The red means that we have more than 7% of our population that is receiving disability payments. Now, some of those are absolutely legitimate disabilities. We have a system in place to take care of workers who are injured on the job. But you don't have over 7% of your population there due to black lung or lower back pain. You've got people working the system to get to that. And look at the difference in our statistics. 8.1% in Kentucky, nationally 4.7%. That's huge. That's huge, the amount of folks on disability. And I don't think there's anything that is that different about our population from other states. So we've got to address this issue. And then last, opioid abuse. And this I would list as the 7th major issue facing Kentucky. If you haven't seen it or read it, I encourage you to look at the book Dreamland. The governor recommended this in one of his speeches, and I picked it up. It's a reporter who went to Mexico and these villages where they produce heroin, and went to Los Angeles and all that. But he came back and he said that Portsmouth, Ohio, which is right across the river from us in Kentucky. What's the Kentucky city on this side of Portsmouth? What is it? South Shore, that's right. Portsmouth and South Shore, according to this author, is the epicenter of the nation's opioid problem. And he talks about how pain pills, disability, people taking pain pills, and doctors feeling like they've got to prescribe however many pills somebody asked for, or otherwise they could be legal liable. It's a whole system that came together and created a situation that's absolutely horrible right now, with more people dying from opioid abuse than in car wrecks in Kentucky now. Absolutely horrible situation, and it's not just rural areas, it's not just East Kentucky, it's in Louisville, it's in Lexington. We're the third highest state in opioid drug overdose deaths, and you can see the map there of how we are one of the trailing states in terms of that particular statistic. So the key issues facing Kentucky, I'll just summarize. Pension reform and tax reform I have tied for number 1. Infrastructure 3, education, K-12, and then higher education, workforce participation, and opioid abuse. You say, well, how in the world do we ever tackle those problems? Well, it's kind of like the house. You bought the house, what are you going to do with it? You come up with your vision, you come up with your list of things you need to do to correct it, and you someday have a better house. And we can do that. We can have a better state of Kentucky by keeping an eye on a vision of what we aspire to do and the things that we need to do to implement that vision. And let me just close by giving you 2 examples that I think should give us some encouragement along that line. One is in education. In 1990, we were ranked 48th in the nation, 48th. Some people thought it was 49th, and the phrase was, thank God for Mississippi, because they were 50th. But we were 48th, according to an index that we've done a lot of research on. By 2011, we were ranked 33rd. You say, well, 33rd, is that something to be proud of? Yes. In one generation, we came from the basement up into the middle of the pack on education. You look at some of our 4th grade math and reading scores, and we actually are in the top, in the end of the country. I mean, it's really encouraging. It drops off by high school, but we have some really, really good stuff going on in terms of education reform. We have made a difference. So that's looking at one generation. Well, back to my illustration of what we would be talking about last year and the fact that a lot of that got implemented. In 1 year, you can make progress on these things that we need to do to have a better house. So with that, I'll close out. Oh, and this is to illustrate we can get better from good, better to best, right? Right. We can keep the upward trajectory there.